Interested in learning about wine, but not sure where to start? You're in the right place. Welcome to the Cork and Fizz Guide to Wine podcast. I'm your host, Haley Bowman, and I'm so glad you're here. I'm a wine enthusiast turned wine educator and founder of the Seattle-based wine tasting business, Cork and Fizz. It is my goal to build your confidence in wine by making it approachable and lots of fun. You can expect to learn everything from how to describe your favorite wine to what to pair with dinner tonight, and so much more. Whether you're a casual wine sipper or a total cork dork like myself, this podcast is for you. So grab yourself a glass and let's dive in. Hello and welcome back to the Cork and Fizz Guide to Wine podcast. Before we meet today's guest, I want to give you a little bit of background knowledge. So we're going to be talking about hybrid grapes. And before we talk about those, we need to talk about Vitis vinifera. Vitis vinifera is a species of grape that nearly all European wines are made from, and thus most wines in the world are made from. However, there are other species of grapes. So again, Vitis vinifera is what it's the species of grapes that most of our wines are made from. But there are other species of grapes, including, for example, Vitis labrusca, which is the species that Concord grapes, the snacking grapes, are made from. And that's a U.S. species. Now, hybrid grapes are essentially when two varieties from two different vine species, so for example, Vitis vinifera and Vitis labrusca, are crossed to create a new variety. And the way this is done is the flower of one plant is fertilized with pollen of another. And this creates a new grape variety. So again, typically you're going to have a species like Vitis vinifera as one of these species of vines that are crossed, and then something like that Vitis labrusca or other native species to the area to help with hardiness. So the Vitis vinifera gives complexity and the other one gives hardiness. Now, with that said, I'd like to introduce you to a winemaker that opened up her own winery just 8 miles from where I grew up. Erin Rasmussen grew up in Madison, Wisconsin, and experienced the intense pleasure of seasonal produce and handcrafted cheese. Her interest in flavor grew into a passion for fermentation and wine, and in 2008, she relocated to Napa Valley to pursue a winemaking career. She completed her graduate studies in winemaking and viticulture at Lincoln University in New Zealand in 2012. Then, in 2017, she moved back to Wisconsin, motivated by her desire to explore the complexities of cold climate winemaking. And in 2018, she founded her innovative wine brand, American Wine Project. And she's now a champion of hybrid grapes. I am super excited for you to hear from her. So, without further ado, let's get into the interview. Why don't we just kind of jump in and you want to tell us a little bit more about who you are and what you do?
Sure. My name's Erin Rasmussen, and I am a winemaker, and I started American Wine Project in 2018 in Wisconsin. And the goal of this project is to figure out what hybrid grapes want to do in this region. Things have changed a lot in the last 5 years since I started this, but that's the original goal was to highlight grapes that are planted in the middle of the country that don't get much love from the global wine industry. And they're starting to get some love. So it's things, the landscape's changed quite a bit since I left the West Coast. Yep.
No, I love it. Yeah, it's super fun. And we're going to talk more about the hybrid grapes during this episode. I think it's such a fun thing. And it's just something new to the wine world, which, it definitely needed. But, new as in new that people are seeing it. They've obviously been around. I should clarify that.
Yeah, there's two kind of branches of the wine industry when you talk about hybrids, especially because there's this ongoing tourist industry that started probably in the 1970s or 80s with wineries that have been, growing in Missouri and other Midwestern states. And they really trade in the experience, right? Like they have people come through, but those wines really haven't made it out into the wider wine industry where people are looking at that region as a serious wine region. It's definitely more tourism thing. So that's the part that's starting to change, which is cool.
Yeah, no, that's exciting. So I'm going to take us back a little bit before the hybrid grapes and just ask what sparked your interest in wine? I'm always so curious because I find that most people's story is somewhat like I fell into it in some way. It's never like a really clear like story. So I'm curious what your story is and how you got into wine.
Yeah, I don't really remember that clearly how it happened. I think, when I was in high school, I got really excited about reading like Food and Wine magazine. And I think maybe it had a little bit to do with like wanting to travel. I studied French all through elementary school, middle school, high school, and even college. And so I think I always wanted to travel to France. And wine is such an integral part of the French lifestyle that maybe that was also part of it. It was just a cultural understanding alongside, all of the other things that, you get graded on, like literature and things like that. And then I think that the other thing is when you live in the Midwest, when produce isn't in season, it's not very good. And so when you get the chance to try things that are in season and ripe, it's like a world apart. So a tomato is not a tomato unless it's in season in the Midwest. And so I think that the care that comes along with that, or like planting it yourself and growing it in your backyard and seeing how much better that tastes, I think that's really similar to what's important about wine growing is, you have to care, you have to have intention, and then you have to really prioritize flavor. So I think it was like my arts background. I really liked the vocabulary of tasting notes and like making brain connections between like the molecules in wine and then flavor components that you recognize in your everyday life. And my first wine job was at like a wine coffee hybrid cafe, but I think I got hired to talk about wine. And I learned, you get excited about it. And I knew French geography. And so I had an easier time kind of explaining things. And you start to understand trends of it's hot here, so the alcohols are a little higher, or, it's cold here, so the acid's higher. And it kind of went from there, but it was a fast turnaround. I mean, my first wine retail job was in 2006, and my first harvest internship was in 2008. And I
Wow.
graduated from college in '05. So it seemed at the time to take forever, but it was a matter of 3 years. And I ended up in California because a friend of mine had moved to Davis for grad school, and she was getting her PhD in nutrition. And she knew I was really into wine. She was trying to get me to move to California, first of all, but she's like, did you know
Sure.
that you can just apply for a job during harvest and you don't need any experience and they just need people to help? And of course, I'd never heard that. I didn't realize that winemaking was a real job. And I did. So I applied for a bunch of jobs that had been posted online, and then I cold called people and sent them emails based on like phone numbers on bottles of wine that I
Oh
liked.
my God.
Yeah. Yeah, and that's who hired me. I worked for Ken Bernard's at Ancien Winery in Napa. So that's Pinot Noir mostly and Chardonnay. And I was terrible at it. I mean, I had no concept of what was involved. It was physical labor and working with machines and pumps and things. Like I had no idea. I was very scared of messing it up. But it got me my second job. And my second job was scary too. It was a massive New Zealand producer, which like in the grand scheme of things certainly is not massive. It was, I think they did 2,500 tons of fruit that year, which is like small in the global scheme of things, but it felt massive. And that was scary for other reasons because I was still learning. And it actually probably took until I was like back from grad school and had a real full-time job where it was like, oh yeah, I've got a pretty good handle on how this goes. But yeah, it's like on the job training. I would recommend anybody who's interested in it is to take an internship before you decide to go to graduate school for winemaking. So you like know whether or not you actually like the work because it's not glamorous. And yeah, and then fell out of love with California and decided to leave.
We'll get to that in a second.
Yeah.
I'm so curious about because I love that you point out like that you dove into it first, tried it out, had that opportunity to see what it was like before officially doing, the grad school and doing that. I'm curious because not all winemakers do a formal education on winemaking. What was the like, did you have any reasoning for wanting to go back to school and have that formal training instead of
Yeah,
just kind of learning on the job more?
yeah, I couldn't get a job. It's truly, I couldn't get hired full time.
Fair.
The wine industry is very sexist. Most full-time jobs were for, cellar hand, cellar master, and I'm not, 6'2" and 200 pounds. I was working in Napa, which is kind of a feeder industry for UC Davis. So people getting bachelor degrees or second generation winemakers kind of slot in, or, people who are older than I was came in from different careers and or had a lot of money. Maybe they came from finance and they had a different way of getting in. Or they just met the right person and
Yeah.
found a mentor, and that's how their career went. And that's definitely not how mine went. I scrambled a lot. I was unemployed a lot. I took a lot of tasting room jobs and asked for advice from people. And it seemed like going to school was going to be something I could put on my resume that would help me get the next job.
No, that makes a lot of sense and brings up a lot of great points about, yeah, getting into wine. First of all, winemaking is a hard job. And then it's hard to get into, like you said, and because there are so many, there is the sexism and racism, and then you have it's typically family based. And so, right, you have a good way in if if your family or your family was in wine, right? And if you don't have connections, it's really hard to get into it.
Yeah. Yeah. It's definitely a connection based industry for better or for worse. I've figured out once I found my community, making connections is very easy and fun and beautiful because it's a community. But when you're trying to trying to get in to a place that you don't fit,
Yeah.
it's a lot harder. So, the big challenge for me was figuring out where I fit in the industry and then the next steps.
Yeah. Okay. So I feel like we're kind of getting into what is like my big question, which I've always said when I found like how I found American Wine Project was I was home visiting family. So I live like my hometown is like 8 miles from your winery and from the tasting room. And so
That's
I
pretty
was
cool.
home visiting family and I was like, gonna spend the day with my grandma. And I was like, what should we do? I should look for something like fun and unique that we haven't done before. And like, there aren't that many options. It's small town, Southwest Wisconsin, right? So like, most of the typical stuff was popping up, and then up came American Wine Project, and I was like, "Whoa, I haven't seen this before." Like, what is this? And like, she's not a huge wine drinker, but bless her heart, she came with me anyway. I think she just likes spending time with me. So she came and we did the tasting there, and it was just so cool to see this winery that, like you said, a lot of wineries in that area tend to be very experience based, which that's not a bad thing. But as somebody like myself who wants to learn more about the wine and is really into the wine, it was so cool to see a winery in that area that was producing these wines that they really cared about and put time and energy into. So I have to ask you though, like, why Wisconsin? Obviously, you grew up there, so I see the connection there. But like, what was it when you were in California and you're like, nope, I'm going back to Wisconsin. I'm doing these hybrid grapes. Like, this is my path.
Yeah, the process was really how do I leave California? And it wasn't just that I didn't feel like I was finding my niche in the industry there, but I was also looking at, you know, before I left before those fires in 2017, but prior to that, there had been a 7 year, I think it was about 7 years of major drought. I mean, hence fires, but major drought where people were really worried about like the reservoirs. And Los Angeles was, starting to talk about where's our water going to come from? Like, and then other states are getting mad about the Colorado River and who gets that water. And so, like, watching the beginning parts of climate change discomfort, like policy discomfort about like how are we going to manage this, and nobody's really got an answer, made me start thinking like I'm not really enjoying my career here anyways. I don't have any connections to California other than like my career. Where else can I do this? And I was working for Gallo at the time. My last job in California was for about a year at Gallo of Sonoma and Healdsburg, and my manager there was fantastic. And we would have one-on-one meetings where he would actually act as a mentor, which like truly, it's a huge priority to me to help people figure out, where they're going in this industry, because finally somebody helped me and it made a huge difference. But I was telling him, I would have all of these ideas and thoughts about like what products we were working on, and why, and where they would end up, and who the customer was, and what I thought was interesting about the industry. And he kind of looked at me and he's like, you might be able to do this for somebody else, but it's going to happen a lot faster if you do it on your own.
Mm.
Which I'd never thought I wanted to start a business. What a terrible lifestyle to run a small business. What lifestyle? I mean, it's like ends up being all
True.
encompassing. So I considered, I thought about moving back to Wisconsin. I wasn't really ready yet. And I thought about maybe moving into cider and working with apples. I thought about Oregon briefly, but didn't really see it wasn't enticing enough for me to move to another state, start with zero connections, and try to build in the same kind of community. I thought about Eastern Washington, like Spokane area. I thought about Boise area. I do have family in Boise. And I realized that like wherever I was going to go, I wasn't going to have the same support system and like personal support system as I would back in Wisconsin in Madison. So my family lives in Wisconsin. I have really wonderful old friends. I'm 39. We've been friends for 30 years at this point, who live in Madison. And so it just felt like if I was going to take this huge risk and do something really hard, maybe that's not a bad thing, right? And I knew I was going to have to work with hybrid grapes, which was really scary too, because I think that overwhelmingly the refrain was, well, we can make better wines when there's better grapes. That's the reason why the Midwest is overlooked as a wine region. That also, for me, got solved through Gallo. They had a research vineyard next to a Pinot vineyard I was sampling during harvest. And my boss is like, do you want to go look at these grapes that grow in Wisconsin? And I said, of course I do.
Yeah.
So, I walked through and like tasted the grapes and in various stages of ripeness, and was like, well, there's nothing, like, they're different, but there's nothing wrong with these grapes. Like there's nothing bad about them. They don't taste gross. They taste interesting. There's something there. And I realized that there's no reason I couldn't do something worth doing that I was proud of for myself, that spoke to the kinds of wines I wanted to make with these grapes, where they were from. I mean, a lot of these hybrids were crossbred by Elmer Swenson in Wisconsin. And then he worked alongside the University of Minnesota, which has had a grape breeding program for over 100 years. And they're releasing grapes too. So these are truly, northern Midwestern grapes. And then not to mention all of the other grapes that are inherently American, like Norton or Cynthiana, like Black Spanish or Lenoir, like Cayuga, like Catawba. And you start to dig into pre-prohibition wine stuff, and you realize that like the cradle of American wine is the Ohio River Valley. So there's something really compelling about seeing what kind of style and, regional decision making, and like what's interesting about what's possible out here with the tools that now exist in the form of, for me, cold climate grapes, but wild grapes too. I think that this is getting further from your question, but I think American palates are more adventurous, and I think we have the beer industry to thank for that. And so I think that approaching wine with a more open mind, especially with younger generations, is definitely a trend. So people are like, well, let's try it. Why not? Like if it's got a cool label, which is really, packaging is really important. If you have a cool label, I mean, somebody cares about it. Let's try it.
Yes. And you definitely killed it on that. The labels at American Wine Project are so fun.
Thanks. Yeah.
It's definitely enough to draw the eye.
It was definitely intentional. Yeah.
I love it. Well, let's dive a little deeper then into, you kind of started talking about some of the grapes, and I know you can't say this about all of them, but I would love to learn kind of how does the winemaking process differ when working with these hybrid grapes compared to the European grapes?
Yeah. The biggest learning curve for me was acidity, I think. These grapes are really high in acid, and that has to do with the wild grape DNA that's in a part of their makeup. Wild grapes are really high in acid. They're not very nice to eat. And so making wines with acidity that is so high and pHs that are so low can be really challenging. And so I had to change, I had to change what grape growers were measuring. Basically, I moved back and all of my growers asked me what Brix, what sugar do I want to pick at, which is shorthand for ripeness, sort of, but not really. And I said, well, I mean, like 20, like I don't care, like enough. In some of these grapes, they don't achieve 20 Brix. They don't even achieve 15 Brix, that you pick them at 12. And that's really it's like the expectations for chemistry in these grapes. You have to fundamentally like retrain your brain to think about how to work with what you've got. So 12 Brix in California, I would be laughed at for picking anything there because it's not wine. That's like 7%. I mean, it is wine, but like it's not wine. And then everyone here still has a hangover of trying to mimic California Cab at 15.5%, right? So they're asking for
Right.
30 Brix. They're not usually asking for that. But they want 26, 27, probably means there's raisoning, soaks up to 30, something like that. So, and around here, it rains all the time. So if you get rain during ripening and like through the harvest season, you are grappling with increased mildew pressure. You're grappling with like split berries because the cells, have to expand and contract the water and they'll open up and then that leaves you open to sour rot, which is vinegar. Basically, the fruit flies come through and they start moving this bacteria around the vineyard. So in certain years, and I've seen it, the very first year I was back, walked through a vineyard and all you could smell was vinegar,
Wow.
which I'd never seen. Like I'd heard of it before and I'd never seen it. And I was just like appalled. Have I seen it since? Yeah, not to that extent. I mean, we had like a major climate change associated like rain deluge in 24 hours, but it happens. So for me, it's become much more of a pH question. I can do whatever I want with sugar. I have the ability, if I wanted to chaptalize. I can add sugar before fermentation. It's very common in Europe. It's really common in the Midwest, and bump up that Brix level. I don't do that because I don't care. I want the grapes to be what they are. And if you start adding stuff, you're taking away your ability to show terroir, basically. But pH, like if something's below 3, my yeast is going to have a really hard time doing its job. Malolactic bacteria is not happy. So I started asking for like, well, I need pH of 3 at least. And most of the growers I spoke with were like, what do you mean? Like, I don't know what that is. And I don't know how to measure that. I don't have the equipment. And that's changed. Most people, varying levels of fluency with taking, pH measurements, but they understand what I'm asking for. Then the next step with that is going to be understanding, like helping farmers understand viticultural techniques. So you get what you want. And for me,
Okay.
what I want is decreasing acidity and increasing Brix, and then figuring out how to get it like your flavor and your Brix level and your acidity all hits your target when it's ready to pick. And then you pick. It's never perfect because, like I said, it rains a lot. There's no labor. So this is friends and family volunteering to pick. We don't have crews. There are no crews to do any work. There's definitely migrant labor in Wisconsin, but the wine industry is very small. And so it's not enough sustained work for them to be interested in those jobs. So they're off doing other really hard work, like picking cucumbers. So most of the time we have to shoot for a harvest date a week ahead on a
Oh,
Saturday or a Sunday. And I have no choice over it. So I mostly let the growers pick the final date. It's a conversation up until about the week before. And then I say, tell me when you're going to do this and we'll do it. The other side of it is these grapes generally don't have a lot of tannin that sticks around during the winemaking process. And that's really unfamiliar for people, especially when they're expecting American wine to taste like California wine, which is like, especially for Cabernet, is very tannic. So in general, there's a lot of added tannins in wines when they're supposed to be big, bold reds. I think tannin is a really important part of wine balance, but I'm not interested in adding powdered tannin. So do a lot of whole cluster fermentation and try to draw tannins out of the stems and the seeds and the skins and see where that gets me. And sometimes it gets me pretty far. But again, for the wine consumer, you just have to realize that like these grapes in this location, you're dealing with a completely different style. Like there's tons of examples of low tannin red wines around the world, often from places that are cold, like Germany. But they're legitimate styles. And so it's, just starting to understand that we're building the future with these decisions that we're making.
Do you ever find yourself standing in front of the wine aisle at the grocery store, feeling completely lost and overwhelmed? Don't worry, you're not alone. But what if I told you that I have a way to transform the wine aisle from overwhelming into an endless sea of joy and discovery? And it involves drinking wine and joining the most welcoming and fun community. In my Court Crew Virtual Tasting Club, we're all about exploring new and exciting wines in a fun and supportive community. No more feeling intimidated or stuck in a rut of buying the same bottle of wine. Each month, we explore 2 new wines, so you can broaden your palate and explore new flavors. Not only will we taste these wines together, but we'll learn about where the wines come from, essentially traveling the world all through the wine in our glass. Come join the Court Crew, and you'll have the opportunity to taste new wines, meet winemakers and other wine professionals, and connect with like-minded wine lovers from all over the world. Imagine the joy of discovering a new favorite wine and being able to confidently choose a bottle that you know you'll love. So, why not join us? Head to my website at corkandfizz.com/thecourtcrew to sign up. And don't forget to use code WINE101 to get your first month free. And now, back to the show. I love when I asked about like winemaking and like the biggest thing was more about the grapes themselves. Like that was one of the biggest right? Because like, and that is so important. Like I think we forget that like it's the grapes that are the product that make your wine. And so much of the work isn't in the cellar. It's figuring out the grapes on the vines and the changes you can make there. One of the things you mentioned with the grapes have high acidity, just naturally very high acidity. Did that influence, and even with the tannins too, as well, with lower tannins, did that essentially kind of like, did you let that influence what wines you created? Like, did you wait to see like what the grapes were doing if they didn't provide? Like one thing that comes to mind to me is like, if it's super high acid, maybe like a sparkling wine, because that would help with the acidity. Or like, were there any decisions like that were made that were purely like, okay, I think I'm just gonna have to take it in this direction because of the grapes?
Sort of. I mean, sparkling wine is a different beast just because you have to have bandwidth to make a pet nat. That's a lot of work during harvest because it's finished during harvest, basically. Traditional method, you need equipment and like logistical and operational planning. And that's not something I have yet. Do I have plans to make a traditional method? Yes. Have I started building a base wine? Yes. Do I know exactly how I'm going to do it? Not yet. But yeah, there's a reason that I'm going to do it. And I think that's one of them is because I have really high acid wine that I think would make a great base wine. But it definitely took a few years for me to like figure out like why and how and what and like who's going to help me do it. Cause I'm still for the most part by myself. But for other things, my style decisions were based on what I was tasting and sort of sparks of inspiration for like, well, this reminds me of this, or I think this would do really well with this technique. So for example, when I started looking at Rihanna, I was just blown away by how tropical it is. Passion fruit, guava. It's like, sometimes I joke that it's like Sauvignon Blanc on psychedelics. And so I knew I wanted to make it, I have some experience working in New Zealand. I wanted to kind of highlight those flavors as New Zealand has really, made a name for itself doing. But the Sauvignon Blanc from New Zealand that I found most interesting were the versions that were barrel fermented, have some lees contact, maybe weren't temperature controlled. So they were building up some viscosity through fermentation choices. So that was one of the first wines that I made with Summerland with that technique. It was direct press, 2 barrel, fermented, aged on heavy lees, partial malolactic fermentation. I did inhibit, I think it was like 25% went through ML. The rest, the other 3 out of 4 barrels, I sulfured before that. So I retained some malic acid and it was really tart. And, feedback I got from people was like, well, what if you left a little bit of RS to balance it out? Like, yeah, that's totally normal thing. Do I have a way to sterile filter it so it doesn't re-ferment in the bottle? No. So I can't leave anything for yeast to eat because I don't want to inadvertently make a bomb, basically.
Right. Leave that sugar in and then bottle
Yeah.
it and the yeast eats the sugar and
Right.
boom.
So I could buy a filter and sterile filter, and I'm not really big on like tight filtration like that anyways. Or I could figure out how to pasteurize. That's a whole other like engineering thing, which I would have to deal with and would probably change the wine as well. And so for me right now, with how I want to do things, I need to not have sugar. But now that that wine's been in the bottle for 5 years, I'm speechless. Like it's so incredible and layered and like coming into its own. I mean, 5 years for a white wine made in Wisconsin. Like,
Yeah.
yeah, and it's bananas. It's just like, I mean, not flavor profile like those any sort of like banana esters are
Good
long gone
clarification,
extinct.
yes.
But it doesn't taste like it's aged. It tastes extremely fresh. It tastes extremely energetic. So it's a lot of gut instinct and then committing to it, I guess. I mean, I tasted Frontenac Gris. I think Frontenac Gris is a pretty nondescript grape for the most part. Well, what happens if we whole cluster ferment it and like make a Ramato style and really push the texture, which to be frank is exactly like the thing with Pinot Gris right now is like everybody poo-pooed Pinot Gris as being so boring, and it can be. But what's cool about that grape is the texture and the ability to maybe pull some color out of the skins. And so you start to see a lot of skin contact Pinot Gris out there, which of course is very traditional in Italy, but what's old is new again. But there's just a lot of it. Some of it is like when I approached Marquette. Well, I have a lot of experience with Syrah Pinot, and that's what that grape reminds me of. So I really just applied those techniques to that grape. Lacrosse to me really reminded me of Chablis or Chardonnay from Jura or something. And so I built the Rivals wine as if I were making really, really, really cold climate Burgundy.
Wow. Okay. So talking about all these grapes, I feel like I want to ask, so with kind of the wines that you have, right? So if someone was listening and they want to try these wines, because I think they're so unique and it's such a fun opportunity to try this different style, like where would you recommend people start? Are they going to like, what are kind of some expectations people should set? Are they going to be very different from what they're used to? How do they know it's like a good quality hybrid grape wine?
Well, I think a lot of times I see people when they know something's a hybrid, they are much more inclined to pick out the differences and to notice them and to comment on them. But when these are served blind, generally people don't think they're American wines in a lot of ways, but they don't think that they're hybrids. They would never guess. And part of that is because like there's just not a lot of hybrid wines out there that are made like this. So why would you assume it was? But as far as like understanding what quality is, I mean, honestly, quality is a personal thing. I can get snobby and talk about like what quality is, but that conversation is quickly becoming really retro. So there's stylistic choices like, do my brainwaves and electrical impulses in my body line up with everybody's on the planet? No. So I can't say that if I think something's out of balance and it's too sweet, that somebody else is going to be like, this is just right. And I mean, that's what's so cool about it. But what I do love about wine is that when you understand how to pay attention, and everybody is inherently good at this because we're humans and we have brains. But when you learn how to pay attention to how wine functions as you taste it, for me, quality comes from the narrative drive of a wine, right? So we talk about other art the same way. You talk about visual art as like there's a narrative there. There's a reason for these brush strokes, right? In wine, there's a reason for the way this wine was put together. And for me, I just have to cede. I mean, I guess all artists probably would say this, but they cede some control to their raw materials, right? pigment would be one in visual arts, or, the size of the brush. Like you can do a lot with it. But I think winemaking is when it's perfect, which is not often, but it's fulfilling its destiny, the winemaker takes a back seat. I'm there as a steward more than a director. And I make decisions, especially before bottling, when I blend my lots together. I'm looking for that literal spark. It feels like a little spark on my tongue of like, oh yeah, this makes sense. There's something here. The acidity works, the textures work, the flavors work, and it all sort of, it's like, I'll go back to the tomato thing, right? Like it's like what your brain feels like when you eat a perfect cherry tomato, right? You feel it. Like
Yeah.
you don't just
Yeah.
there's like a real spark. So for anybody with any wine, like that's why we have those, come to Jesus moments with wine. Is like that bottle that just said something. And if you love wine, there's a reason for that. And there was a bottle that made you think differently about this poison that you're putting in your body on a regular basis, right? Like,
Yes, 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 absolutely. I couldn't agree more. I think it's such a good point of like not only is it like in the way that you explain it too, because I think a lot of people get annoyed with like quality is like or like a lot of like liking a wine is on your own preference and but it's true because it's not even a thing you can put into words. It's a feeling of just like this is it. And because like you can feel that about a wine and somebody else will drink it and be like this ain't it.
yeah. And once you know how to talk about it, you can talk about like why it might be good, but it's not for you. Like
Yeah.
I can talk about why barefoot Moscato is good, but it's not for me.
Yeah.
And is it a high quality wine? Yeah, it is. I know what kind of brain power goes into making that, but the reasons for its existence are completely different than what I'm doing. But the ability of those winemakers to match a style and a flavor and a texture year after year, and it's mostly based on blending, it's blending lots. I mean, certainly there's some ingredients going into that, but it's not a zombie wine. It's not Doritos. Like that's been my other favorite example is like it's real wine, but
Yeah.
you don't have to love barefoot, but you can't make somebody who does love it feel bad about loving it because there's a reason that wine is like that. And
Yeah.
it's because when they were looking for their target of what this wine is supposed to be, that blend had the spark of like this is barefoot Moscato.
That's such a great perspective to take on things. And I really try to always like be open about any style of wine. And I know I can sometimes be a little snobby when it comes to like some grocery
Mhm.
store wines. And so it's always
Yeah.
good to like hear that perspective and hear the thoughts. And you're right. There is like the work of like their goal is to have the same wine every year. So you can always expect what you're getting versus like a lot of times most other smaller wineries, which I find more interesting, but I'm not everybody, right? I'm the one that's like, I want to have something different but not everybody does.
Yeah, I mean, you can see that in other food products too. I mean, there's a subset of consumers who really want like the Starbucks TikTok menu and like the more whipped cream the better, right? And then there's another side of coffee where people want to taste like single origin shade grown. And then there's another subset that realizes that like shade grown's not actually that great when it comes to sustainability. Like maybe we should be talking about the people and like why there's no shade left. So, and the same thing is happening with wine too, is understanding what sustainable means. And it's not just talking about fish friendly or whatever other certification you get by filling out a form online. It's like, how are people getting paid? How are people being taken care of? Why, like, how does this industry support everybody from the bottom up? What's the future? Like, how are we being stewards of not only the land, which is extremely important, but the people who have decided to make this their living?
Yeah, I think it's so interesting. In almost every conversation I've had with winemakers thus far on the podcast, sustainability has come up. So it's really nice to hear that people are thinking about it. Obviously, the negative side of that is it is a problem and that's why people are talking about it. But it seems like it's becoming more and more something that people care about, and hopefully more people who are drinking wine will start caring about it as well. I feel like that transition is happening. So before we finish off our conversation here, I wanted to end with just a fun little speed round of some of your favorites of just to kind of, it's always fun to hear from people who make wine. What do they like, or what are they interested in? So when I say speed round, it's not that I'm expecting you to have like go through this really fast. It's more like, don't worry about thinking about it too much. It's just whatever comes to your mind first.
Yeah. Love it.
So starting with, what is your favorite wine at the moment?
Man, I'm all over the place. I recently bought a bottle of Villa Maria Sauvignon Blanc from New Zealand. It's probably like 12 bucks at the grocery store because I hadn't had a wine that was unabashedly pandering in a really long time. And it was like I couldn't finish it. It was like a little bit too sweet, but it's also really high in acid. So it's not necessarily like a beginner wine, but it's like one of those wines that like it's like training wheels for really challenging stuff because it has the sugar. So it's like, oh, you'll be okay because it's sweet, but it's so high in acid that you start to understand how high acid wines work. So that's actually the last bottle that I purchased with my own money. But I'm also like getting really excited about tasting other hybrid wines from people who are really considering the importance of what we're doing and like how to make wines with this sense of purpose with these grapes. It's a small group still, but like the niche is growing, which is really exciting. That was a long answer to a speed round question, but let's go with like really, really cheap Sauvignon Blanc from New Zealand.
Heck yeah. All right. Okay. How about favorite wine region you've ever visited?
My grad school work was done in New Zealand. I spent some time there. So I'm going to have to go with the Waipara region, which is outside of Christchurch. In my opinion, that might be the most exciting region in New Zealand, certainly. And I haven't actually traveled that much for wine. So yeah.
Well, then that works well for my next question, which is, what's the region you'd like to visit?
Ooh, that is a good question. That's a really good question. And I'm not entirely sure. I spent so much time in France in college that I'd like to go back with like a wine understanding and like talk to people, but probably focusing on like the cooler regions. I'm like a total sucker for the Jura region, and I have been for a decade, probably. Somewhere along the line I tried a vin jaune and it was like mind blowing. So I think I'd probably like to stick to like Alsace, so like Northeast France, like that section of Germany, to see what they're doing with acidity mostly. Yeah.
Cool. I like it. Okay, last two. So favorite wine and food pairing.
Favorite wine and food pairing is sparkling rosé and pepperoni pizza.
Ooh, heck yeah. That sounds great right now. Like it's very much lunchtime. Okay. The last one's also going to be a little more difficult, but I want a chance for you to shout out some of your wines. So essentially, like if someone listening right now wanted to buy 3 bottles of wine, which wines would you recommend they try?
Great question. Also really difficult to answer because they're all so different, right? These varieties are just so different. But I think, okay, I'm going to give you 2 answers. One is going to be for like the person who's like, I don't know if I'm going to like these, and I don't feel like I know that much about wine, and I don't want anything that's like super weird. I just want something that like I'm going to dip my toe in. And for that person, I would say Ancestral, which is a pet nat made with Brianna. So it's fizzy and it's really tropical. And I would say, I'm looking at my bottles on the shelf so I can be like, the 2022 Social Creature Rosé, which is also really bright and luscious and like perfect for summer. And then probably the 2020 Water and Sky Frontenac, which is jammy and juicy and it's got some acidity, but it's got like dark flavors. I always think about it as like my Bordeaux style. It doesn't have that tannin, but it's got that sort of flavor color. So those are the 3 for people who are like, I have no idea what these grapes can do, but I want something that like is going to be recognizable. Not that they're unrecognizable, but I think those are probably like, those are the ones that I usually recommend when, like people come into the wine and you're like, I don't know what I'm doing. For somebody who's like, no, I'm pretty well versed in wine, I kind of want to understand a little bit more about like style options for these grapes. For those people, I'd recommend, first of all, Sound of Memory, which is a red wine. It's a blend this last year, 2020 vintage of Petite Pearl and Maréchal Foch. Maréchal Foch is a hybrid that was developed in Alsace. So it was like one of the originals that was developed to like help solve phylloxera back when that was a really big issue. So it's kind of a heritage one. It's a really challenging wine for me to talk about because it never does what I think it's going to do. But coming into it as like not the winemaker, it's kind of got like a cru Beaujolais thing going on.
Ooh, okay.
And it's really tasting good right now. I would recommend Antipodes, which is the Ramato style Frontenac Gris that we were talking about. The color is very unique. It's very copper, like dark copper, sort of a garnet tinge to it. So like if you look at it and you don't get that nuance with color, you'd say it looks brown. Not brown, but I can see why people would go that direction with their color. And then the third one, honestly, I'd probably go with the Wit and Wisdom Piquette that I made in 2022. I was going to say, we didn't get to talk about the Nouveau that I make that has some Concord grapes in it. I'm not even sure if I'll be able to make that in 2023 for various reasons, but I did use the pomace of that wine for the Piquette, the red Piquette that I made. And so if you want to taste a wine that's made with a serious consideration of what like a Welch's E grape Concord tastes like when you aren't making Manischewitz, plus with the added bonus of like a mixed ferment piquette. So you've got some lactose, some Brettanomyces, all sorts of stuff. That would be a really fun one for people to try too. Yeah.
Oh, cool. That was such a perfect answer to that question. I feel like such a great way to end this. I just really want to like drive people. I feel like it's nice to hear about all this. And then what's so cool is after you've heard us talk, you can now taste, what we've been talking about. So I'm definitely I'll direct people your way. I know you shared a discount code for everybody to use through August 15th. I have here. So Wisco, WISCO for 15% off. And I believe you have an online shop, so you can find it on your website. And then for anybody in the area who's listening, all my family in Southwest Wisconsin, go check out the tasting room over in Mineral Point. All right. Well, thank you so much for joining me, Erin. As usual, I had an amazing conversation and learned a lot.
Thank you. It was really fun to talk to you too.
All right. Thank you. I hope you enjoyed this episode of the Cork and Fizz Guide to Wine podcast and learned something new. If you loved it as much as I did, I would so appreciate it if you could take a quick second to rate it and leave a review. And if you know a wine lover in your life that would love to learn about these hybrid grapes, please share it with them. It would mean the world to me. I highly recommend trying Erin's wine at American Wine Project, whether that's at their tasting room if you're in Southwest Wisconsin or by shopping online. Erin was nice enough to share a discount code with us, so you can use code WISCO, or WISCO, for 15% off. And that is good through the 15th of August in 2023. In next week's episode, we're going to do something special. One of the biggest questions I get is all about food and wine pairings. So I'm going to take my food and wine pairing experience that I've built for tastings, and I'm going to make a podcast about it. So you're definitely going to have to listen to that. Thanks again for listening. And if you want to learn more about wine, come follow me at Cork and Fizz on Instagram. And if you're interested in exploring new wines and joining an incredible community of wine lovers, be sure to sign up for the virtual tasting club, The Cork Crew. Use code WINE101 to get your first month absolutely free. Cheers!